Well, this can be about trading value, but these value can be other things. They can be digital goods. They might be other forms of IP, intellectual properties. So we sort of stand on the cusp of this new era, really, of new possibilities.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Inside R&D, the podcast that gives you behind-the-scenes access to the innovations shaping the future of television and media. Now, when you hear the word blockchain, your mind might jump straight to cryptocurrency hype or even controversy. But what if there's more to this technology than meets the eye? In this episode, I'm joined by lead R&D engineer Nigel Earnshaw to explore distributed ledger technology, or DLT, and why the BBC is taking a closer look at its potential.
They're open to everybody. So as the next generation comes along and gets used to them, I think we might end up with a much more wholesome, inclusive digital world. Well, maybe these are going to become mainstream now. Maybe this is the future.
So, can blockchain actually help the BBC better serve the public? To kick things off, I asked Nigel to help us untangle the basics of DLT. There's two words that we'll start with, blockchain and crypto, which have become real buzzwords over the last few years, and I think it's fair to say mostly have negative connotations around them. But the BBC is doing quite a bit of research to understand the functionality of the technology and why it might be useful. It's quite a confusing space, and I know a lot of people find the technology confusing. So why don't we just start by exploring what is a distributed ledger, what relation does that have to blockchain and cryptocurrencies?
Right, well, that's a good question. So if we think of DLT, decentralized ledger technology, as if you like the platform, and these platforms have various properties and characteristics which are really interesting and sort of stand in contrast to centralized technologies. So by decentralized, really, we mean that these platforms, everything is sort of replicated on every instance of the platform, if you like. So rather than having an aggregated service provided by one service provider, perhaps in one or more geolocations, these things are literally distributed around the world. But each instance of that distributed technology is a sort of replica of other ones, and this means that there doesn't really need to be a centralized authority managing the day-to-day running, if you like. It's the technology itself, which, because it's replicated all over the world, is very resilient. It means that people can contribute to the network, and if they stop contributing to the network can continue without them because there's lots of nodes there. So they have various sort of magic properties around their resilience to attack. And the decentralization is really about the decentralization of authority, if you like. So they're not all run by one organization. So in the case of Bitcoin, anybody can be a Bitcoin miner. Anybody can take on that technology and use that technology. By running part of the network, you're adding to the resilience of the network, if you like. You're not relying on other people to do it. Everybody's doing it. So as long as there are a lot of people are doing it, there must be a network there. So that's where it gets this kind of decentralized word from. There's not a centralized authority sort of in charge of it. So the interesting thing is that the initial use case that we're all sort of very familiar with would be things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies more generally. And the interesting thing about that is that currencies are sort of literally a replacement for money, if you like. So the interesting thing is that clearly people who deal in managing money, they've got a huge incentive to sort of be dishonest actors and to try and sort of game the system. So the fact that Bitcoin's been there a long time and it's still running tells us something about the resilience of this technology. So there is something in this technology which is interesting, and people use it for transferring value around the world. So that's interesting. So we're not particularly interested in the cryptocurrency aspect because that was just like the most prevalent and initial use case, if you like. So that's how the technology is developed. But really, we're interested in the utility of those. What other forms of value can be exchanged over these platforms? Can it be more general than just a cryptocurrency? So then we see people trying to use these networks for a different kind of utility. They want to provide services on them. They want to provide more generalized, more familiar services on these platforms. So then we're up in this new world where these platforms are really good because the platform can be maintained regardless of a particular authority. But they're also quite limited in their computational power. So in particular, so the baseline general purpose computing decentralized platform is obviously Ethereum. And that's kind of like the general, like in terms of cryptocurrency, you think of Bitcoin. In terms of generalized computing, decentralized technology, you think of Ethereum. There's lots of competitors, but the industry generally would see that as a baseline. You compare yourself with the differences between your platform and Ethereum. And Ethereum is a very open community, so there's lots of technical details, lots of releases about their roadmap and what they're doing. So it's quite a nice community. So the difference now is that although we might have said in the past, oh, well, that's all cryptocurrency, nothing to do with media, nothing to do with a public institution. Now we're thinking, well, in terms of utility, in terms of exchanging value, and in terms of the way the public might start to interact with these things for different reasons, not to do with cryptocurrency, that might provide a new way to reach audiences. So that's where we're suddenly thinking, well, maybe this is a new paradigm. Maybe Web3, as we call it, will become something that people start to use more seamlessly and start to enjoy, and they start to use their cryptocurrencies in more general ways rather than just exchanging cryptocurrencies for their intrinsic value.
So Web3 is this kind of like an updated version of the World Wide Web, or is that thinking a bit too dimensionally? Is perhaps the possibilities are even greater?
So I think one way of thinking about Web3 is really that you can sort of say Web 2 is the age of services and streaming and accessing things, and to some extent, of course, contributing to things as well as we see. And Web 3 is more characterized by ownership. This idea that if you upload something and it's cryptographically attached to your wallet, which is your sort of presence, then you can maintain some control over it. And we see this with things like, traditionally NFTs and this idea of owning images and trading images. The characteristic we're pulling out of there is this idea that you own things. So Web3 is a little bit more about having a digital economy where you own your artifacts and you have some say over it and you might want to trade them. And again, it comes back to this idea of trading value in much the same way as the original cryptocurrency models are about trading value. Well, this can be about trading value, but these value can be other things. They can be digital goods. They might be other forms of IP, intellectual properties, as we say. So Web3 is about moves towards a web of ownership.
What does the blockchain part have to do with this? Is that another word for decentralized ledger technology, or is that another part of it?
So yeah, people use the word blockchain, and I guess in a way it's it's shorthand for a decentralized ledger now, really is what it is. So the blockchain itself, that term comes from a very specific way in which these systems maintain all the sort of transactions. So apart from being distributed and being run by different parties who don't know each other, have no particular relationship to each other, one of the underlying characteristics is that everything that gets done gets put on a ledger. So a ledger being like a list of transactions, a bit like your bank account. So although they're immutable, when a transaction's occurred, it's recorded for all time. The value, in your account, the value accrued to your wallet can change over time as these transactions all affect the ultimate value. So that's the idea of a ledger. And the way that these systems certainly originally ran these ledgers is every time you get a bunch of transactions, you can log them and you can chain them together with previous transactions. So the cryptographic chaining, this idea of using cryptography, not in terms of currency, but as a mathematical discipline to try and ensure the integrity of this long ledger that's growing forever was, if you like, a chain of blocks. So that's how it got its name. But actually, when we think about blockchain more generally, and we think about DLT more generally, well, first of all, there's lots of innovation in all aspects of DLT, including, the way that these ledgers are formed through this chain of blocks, the way that they're verified, the way that the different nodes, i.e. all of the different computing platforms, keep track of each other in a kind of a consensus. So they all know where they are. They all know the world state. They all know what the platform view of the world really is. So So there's lots of innovation at all levels. And also the entire ecosystem is also expanding. So it's not just, it's a bit like the early days of computers. You might have had a computer and you could type into it and it could do some sums for you. But then as they developed, so input and output became much more important. So you needed to be able to store things, you need to be able to communicate between them. And so we see with these DLT ecosystems, the ecosystem itself is now becoming a wider thing. So, things like verifiable computing and indexing services are also services around them. So although we still talk about blockchain and we're referring to that very specific component, which still exists, but obviously different platforms have different ways of doing it. So they're still known as blockchain, but actually it's a shorthand for a much wider environment. It's a shorthand for a much more sophisticated platform. And in fact, I would say it's a shorthand for a much wider ecosystem where these platforms can now interact with other platforms and with other services.
So why do you think it's gained so much attention in a fairly short amount of time? Other companies are definitely looking into this technology as well. I know we've talked about Sony and Sony's is it Sonarium? Is that their version?
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
So what is it that is making everybody so excited about it?
Yeah, so I think that there's a number of things actually. So first of all, the technology, if you like, has improved as you might expect. So originally, people would say, "Oh, that's no good as a platform because the number of transactions that they could handle was very slow compared with sort of a proper payment system, if you like, a centralized payment system." So that was always like a thing. But obviously, over time, over quite a short time, despite the complexity and the innovation on these platforms, they have managed to improve them and continue to improve them. And then the other thing that's happening that I think is significant is that people are looking at these not only for utility, but also in sort of governmental terms. How do you have a digital economy and could this underpin it? And so, as we've already spoken, the initial use cases around cryptocurrencies, which are very volatile, and you might say can't really run a serious economy for everybody. They have their place, but then they're not really the same as your standard currency, which is sort of guaranteed by your government. But as we move forward, governments are showing more and more interest, and there's a lot more interest around stable coins. And in the US at the moment, there's a lot of legislation going through the Senate to try and make these things more regulated. And if that happens, it means that to use these platforms in everyday life wouldn't mean that you're speculating on these volatile cryptocurrencies. You might say, I just want to use some guaranteed currency. I want to pay the price of something and I want it to hold in the traditional way. So it looks as if now governments are getting to the point where regulators are going to start, on the one hand, they're regulating this kind of maverick platform and these kind of new ideas, which seems kind of odd. But on the other hand, if they do that and you have the security that you have in normal currency terms, it starts to look like a serious trading platform. So couple that with the increased performance, couple that with the ongoing roadmap of development that we see, once the governmental regulators start to say, what you can do, what you can't do, what banks should do, what they shouldn't do. So it's just another reason to sort of say, well, maybe these are going to become mainstream now. Maybe this is the future, and we should at least, as a public institution ourselves, start to get our head around what that really means and what opportunities it may bring to us.
So, kind of evidenced by our discussion so far already, the narrative is kind of dominated by use case of cryptocurrencies with this technology. Do you think that, and it sounds like the technology has got endless kind of innovative possibilities. Do you think that by focusing solely on the cryptocurrency use case, that's perhaps hurting the technology's reputation and maybe as a result hurting its sort of long-term potential?
So I think initially, certainly in the public eye, because if you like, these so-called currencies weren't perhaps currencies in the way that the general public would use them. That obviously gives, and when people lose money because the perceived value of something collapses, or when people have particularly sort of with the NFT thing, where people see, a huge amount of value in something that they might not normally value, then that gives that I think that does sort of scare off, if you like, the sort of general public, general businesses. So that's one thing, but the counter to that is that you can see that these technologies sort of left in the wild with all of this sort of value locked into them, this so-called total value locked, with all of these things, that it's also a huge stress test. You could say, well, at least this technology has now been completely stress tested. Everybody who wanted to break it, everybody wanted to show it doesn't work, have failed, and it still works. So it works in this limited way. So I would say we've learned two things over the last 15 years. We've learned that A, this kind of fantastical idea does stand up. B, yes, people want to use it in these slightly new sort of maverick ways. But having done all that, we sort of look at this and sort of rub our chins and go, maybe there is a future for this in more traditional ways. And maybe, and I guess this is an issue for all of us, is that the traditional ways themselves will evolve, if you like, given this new degree of freedom. So it's a sort of a bit of a new frontier. And we can look back at what's happened and say, that wasn't really a sort of thing a public institution wants to get involved in. But looking forward, we sort of look at it and think, well, there were certain things worked and certain things didn't. So let's see what the future holds as the technology matures, which it certainly is doing.
Curious to learn more about the things we're discussing today? Head over to bbc.co.uk/RD to explore the full range of BBC R&D's work, including cutting-edge projects, groundbreaking research reports, and white papers on broadcasting and technology going back nearly a century. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the use of this technology around things such as content attribution or content credentials. Obviously, I've had a discussion in a previous episode about content credentials and tackling misinformation. It seems like this could be quite an interesting area to explore if the BBC was interested in doing so.
Yeah, and I think one of the ideas is that you can register things sort of in perpetuity on a network. That doesn't, just because you register it doesn't mean that it's yours. But if you're first to register it and you can prove that it's yours, then that can be very useful. And it can also then be useful for other people to be able to retrieve that information. So in your previous discussions, you've talked about standardized ways of recording provenance and binding that provenance to content. So then you have, if you like, a digital representation of who created content. So first of all, you could make that you could put that on a public database. You could put it on any public database. It doesn't have to be a decentralized one. So then you start to ask yourself, well, what if you did start logging these things somehow on a blockchain DLT kind of platform? Why would you want to do it on a decentralized system? And then you say, well, maybe that's because you actually wanted more than just the provenance. So provenance exists by itself. That's a good enough thing. Attribution and provenance, that's great. But what if you want to link that into other systems? What if you want to link that into sort of rights systems, payment systems, things that we know blockchains can also do because they can attribute things to particular wallets, and because wallets can exchange value through various tokens or currencies or temporary tokens or even stable coins should they become a thing. So people are looking and saying, well, there's provenance, that's a thing, but we could keep that anywhere. But if we did keep it on a DLT platform, that might give us scope for a wider way of using it and a wider way of distributing media, accessing media. And of course, from the BBC's point of view, that's not just about content distribution. It can be also about the way that we collect content from various sort of value chain players. Some of whom will be professional people that we know, and they just want a good way of transferring the value and recording that we're using it and all that kind of thing. But also in the wider kind of world of user-generated content, we see more and more things on the news now that are taken just by members of the public who happen to be there with their phone. So is that a new form of content ingest? Is that becoming a bigger thing? And how do those people get attribution? Should they be thinking about registering things? So, I mean, of course, there are a number of startups which are exploring exactly this area. And as we see sort of content credentials and access to blockchains being built into mobile devices, it's just kind of like, well, all the pieces are there. It's just, are people going to, is there value in putting these together? What is the sort of future business model? What are the future use cases of this technology? And I think that's where we are now. I think that the technology is good enough to really investigate these use cases, and it'll move there quite quickly if that's the path forward. And maybe that's something the BBC should think about in terms of what does that world look like, and what does that mean for public service broadcasting, and how do we serve our audiences who have that much power?
You touched on the concept of privacy earlier, and that's obviously a really hot topic. People's personal data being used for various new emerging pieces of technology. Are there associated risks around DLT and personal data? I'm assuming that there is, because DLTs sort of operate on a very sort of public ledger record system. What's the deal with that?
Well, they do and they don't. So for sure, everything is logged. But when I say everything, you don't want to put your personal data onto a blockchain. And the nice thing about the whole blockchain community is they are, at their heart, they are creative people, and there's also a lot of cryptographers who are very passionate about privacy and have some absolutely ingenious, mind-blowing ways of allowing things to happen that can be proved, but without revealing the nature of that data. So privacy goes hand in hand with sort of cryptography, really. Cryptography as a mathematical discipline. And also, because of the accessibility of these platforms, again, there are these two forces. So we know, in the European Union, there's a lot of governmental activity around using blockchains to support individual IDs and individual credentials, things that you might like in public life in order to be able to access services, across state boundaries and all that kind of thing. But then you say, but wait a minute, you don't want people to see those credentials. So that's a problem, but it's not an obstacle. So for instance, you wouldn't put your private credentials on the blockchain, but you might keep them in your wallet, and you might keep them encrypted in your wallet. So why would you do that? Well, because only you have those keys. Those keys don't exist anywhere else. Nobody else can steal those keys. You can't have a centralized cloud service that gets raided and you lose your keys because they're not on the cloud service. They're just in your wallet. So you have complete control over it. So in the simplest scenario, you might want to do some work with me. So you discover my wallet, maybe you know me, you know my wallet address, and then we can transfer things privately out of band. You don't need to see everything about me on the blockchain. You just need to know how to prove I own a particular wallet, and then we can use the digital credentials in a much more sort of straightforward and common sense way without having to show the world. So it's just really interesting, the whole thing of like, how can you have a computer that's not owned by anybody? How can you have privacy on a public network? All of these things, they are the sort of bread and butter of this community. And this kind of ingenious cryptographical approach to everything seems to be making a lot of progress. It'll take some time yet, but it's the new frontier, and it's absolutely fascinating.
So what's the one thing that you wish more people understood about blockchain and DLT's potential for great innovation and an exciting future? So
I would say, don't worry about the speculative sort of games that are being played, or the early release of ideas that didn't really work. What you need to see is that the technology is ingenious, and that it works, and that over time people will think of ingenious ways of using it, which matches some of the kind of foundational work that's been going on. And I think that really all that needs to happen is for the sort of higher level application community to sort of catch up with some of the thinking of the more foundational community, and then we'll start to see real strides. And obviously the financial industry is the first to go with this. But the financial industry has always been a leader in sort of cryptographical things because of the nature of their business. And we know that now that government is also looking at this to sort of say, is this a way of building a truly digital economy? Is it in everybody's hands yet? Or will there be an issue where, the haves can do it and the have-nots still can't? Can this technology reach people where current technology hasn't been able to reach? And I think we're coming back to that world. We see people in Latin America using cryptocurrencies a lot more heavily than other people. We see a more general adoption. So there is a kind of a community, social, democratic edge to this, which is really interesting. If you can just say, yeah, we know that the speculative coins, didn't always work for everybody, and therefore we don't want to do that. But are there other forms of value? So maybe we're on the frontier where what we need now is people to think long and hard about how we can make a better world using these new paradigms, this so-called Web3 paradigm.
So have you figured out yet what that new world looks like? What is the blockchain ecosystem future? What does that look like?
Yeah, but that's the $1 million question. I suppose my view of the future is I kind of imagine a world where we all have, some digital currencies somehow, perhaps on our mobile phone. We don't necessarily have to accumulate lots of them. We might just have a small sort of cache that we extract and we start using services. And maybe micropayment services might be an obvious, straightforward thing because it's kind of a financial thing, but it would need regulatory, what are you paying with and does it still have value? You don't want to exchange real money into things that then lose value. So how does that work? So I think micropayments, I think more communications, perhaps in a more global sense, more of a global trading platform because it's a global platform anyway. So maybe we could think about exchanging value across the world more easily, selling goods across the world more easily. I think one of the big strands in this world is about supply chains and the integrity of supply chains. So again, not necessarily our business, but in more kind of retail and the provision of goods. How does it help those supply chains? Does it reduce costs? Not in every case. Not every use case can be taken and put on blockchains and made to be better. That's just a fact. But some can, and they might be critical. And I think then we might start seeing new ways of using new ways of using these platforms built on these traditional ways. So I remember when uploading video to websites, it wasn't a remunerated thing. It was just a thing, and it wasn't well thought of. And then various companies started remunerating you through their central systems, and everything suddenly became a lot more professional. We see professional podcasters on various platforms. So that's so that clearly that incentivization has changed the game. It's made it less specialist. It's more of a sort of meritocratic society. So maybe we might get more of that. Maybe we might get more of that kind of human ingenuity made available, human ingenuity forming new business models, human ingenuity moving us forward simply because of the sort of ubiquity of computing and the ubiquity of these platforms. They're open to everybody. So as the next generation comes along and gets used to them, I think we might end up with a much more wholesome, inclusive digital world. Well, that would be the best outcome, and maybe slightly idealistic, but this came from an idealistic place. It's got us this far. So never mind the bumps in the road. Let's just see if we can carry on that line.
Thank you so much for tuning in and being a part of Inside R&D. It's been an incredible few weeks, and while this series might be wrapping up, we are not even close to being done yet. I'll be taking a short break and then returning with Series 2 very soon to continue exploring the future of media and technology. Before that though, I will be recording some one-off Q&A episodes, so make sure you follow or subscribe so you don't miss anything. I would also really appreciate a quick rating or review, as it really helps others find us. Huge thanks, as always, to the incredible team I have supporting me. I'm Joseph Turner, and until I return, take care, be curious, and stay innovative.